Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson had been driving for about 40 minutes when he saw the flashing blue lights in his rearview mirror. His first thought was confusion. He glanced down at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding. He'd been careful like always. The road was nearly empty at this hour, just past 9 in the evening on a December night in Virginia. David was a man who followed rules. 15 years in the United States Army had taught him discipline, respect, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. At 42 years old, he'd served his country in multiple deployments overseas. He'd earned medals, led troops, and carried the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. Tonight he was still in that uniform, driving home from Fort Lee where he'd spent the day in meetings about training protocols. The SUV he was driving was new. Well, new to him. He'd just bought it a few days ago, and the temporary tags were taped in the rear window exactly where they were supposed to be. Everything was legal. Everything was in order. So why were the police lights flashing behind him? He did what any reasonable person would do. He signaled and started looking for a safe place to pull over. The road was dark, with no streetlights and thick trees on both sides. Up ahead, maybe a quarter mile, he could see the bright lights of a gas station. He decided to pull in there. It just made sense. Better lighting, safer for everyone involved. But those few seconds of driving with the police car behind him seemed to make things worse. Another patrol car joined the first one. Now there were 2 sets of flashing lights behind him. David's heart started beating faster. He told himself to stay calm. He'd done nothing wrong. This would all get sorted out quickly. He pulled into the gas station and stopped near the pumps where the lights were brightest. He put the vehicle in park, turned off the engine, and immediately placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. His driver's license was in his wallet in his pocket. His registration was in the glove box. He waited for the officer to approach and ask for them, but that's not what happened. Instead, 2 officers jumped out of their cars with flashlights blazing. They moved quickly, aggressively, positioning themselves on both sides of his vehicle. David could see their hands resting on their weapons. His stomach dropped. Something was very wrong here. "Driver, turn off the vehicle," one officer shouted. "It's already off," David called back, keeping his voice steady and his hands visible. "Get out of the car now." David's mind raced. He'd been pulled over a few times in his life, like most people. It had never been like this. Officers usually walked up, asked for license and registration, explained what you'd done wrong. This felt different. This felt dangerous. "Officer, what's going on?" David asked, still keeping his hands on the wheel.
"Can you tell me what I did wrong?"
"Get out of the car," the officer repeated louder this time. The officer's name tag read Gutierrez, though David could barely make it out in the chaos of flashlights and shadows. "I will. I just want to understand what's happening," David said. His voice remained calm, but inside, fear was creeping in. He'd heard stories. Every black man in America had heard stories. But he was in uniform. He was an officer in the United States Army. Surely that would matter. Another officer, Crocker according to his name tag, moved closer to the passenger side window. "You're being non-compliant." "I'm not trying to be non-compliant," David explained, his hands still locked on the steering wheel. "I just want to know what I'm being pulled over for. I have the right to ask that." "Get out now or you're gonna get it," Gutierrez shouted. David felt his throat tighten. The way the officer said those words, the threat in his voice, it was clear this wasn't going to be a normal traffic stop. A third patrol car arrived and another officer stepped out. Now there were 3 of them, surrounding his vehicle, hands on their weapons, treating him like he was some kind of dangerous criminal. "Gentlemen, I'm serving in the military," David said, hoping that might calm things down. "I'm stationed at Fort Lee. I just want to understand what's happening here." "We don't care about that right now," Gutierrez shot back. "Get out of the vehicle." David's training kicked in. Assess the situation. Calculate the risks. He was dealing with 3 armed officers who were already escalated. If he reached for his seatbelt, would they think he was reaching for a weapon? If he opened the door, would they think he was trying to escape or attack? Every movement felt like it could be misinterpreted. "I'm honestly afraid to get out," David admitted, and it was the truth. His hands were shaking now, still gripping the steering wheel. "Yeah, you should be," Gutierrez responded. And there was something almost satisfied in his voice when he said it. That's when David realized this wasn't about a traffic violation. This wasn't about temporary tags or a turn signal or anything he might have actually done wrong on the road. This was about something else entirely. This was about the color of his skin. This was about 3 officers who had already decided he was a threat before they even saw his face clearly. "Sir, I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army," David said, trying one more time to reach them, to make them see him as a human being, as a fellow American who dedicated his life to serving his country. "I'm not trying to cause any problems. Just please tell me what I did wrong." Gutierrez pulled out his pepper spray and pointed it directly at David's face through the driver's side window. "Get out or you're gonna ride the lightning." David had been in combat zones. He'd been shot at by enemies of the United States. But he'd never felt terror quite like this. Because those enemies overseas, he could identify them. He knew who they were and what they wanted. But these were American police officers, sworn to protect and serve, and they were treating him like he was the enemy. "Please don't spray me," David said, his voice barely above a whisper now. The officers weren't listening anymore. Gutierrez reached for the door handle. Crocker moved in from the passenger side. The 3rd officer positioned himself at the back of the vehicle. They moved with the kind of coordination that suggested they'd done this before, that they knew exactly how to overwhelm someone. David's mind flashed to his family. His wife was probably watching television at home, not knowing what was happening to her husband. His 2 kids were probably doing homework or playing video games, not knowing their father was surrounded by police officers who seemed intent on treating him like a criminal. He thought about all the young soldiers he'd trained over the years. How many times had he told them to respect authority, to trust the system, to believe that justice and fairness would prevail if they just followed the rules? How many times had he assured them that if they did the right thing, they'd be treated fairly? And here he was, having done everything right, being treated like he'd done everything wrong. The situation was spiraling out of control, and David knew that within the next few seconds something bad was going to happen. He could feel it in the air, in the way the officers moved, in the tone of their voices. They'd already made up their minds about him. They'd already decided how this was going to end. All he could do was keep his hands visible and pray that he'd make it home alive. Tonight, the night air was cold when Officer Gutierrez yanked open David's door. Everything happened so fast that David barely had time to process it. One moment he was sitting in his vehicle with his hands on the steering wheel, and the next moment hands were grabbing at him, pulling him, shouting commands that contradicted each other. "Keep your hands up." "No, unbuckle your seatbelt." "Don't move. Get out now." David tried to comply with all of them at once, which was impossible. His seatbelt was still fastened because he'd been too afraid to reach for it earlier. Now as he tried to unbuckle it with one hand while keeping the other hand raised, Officer Crocker shouted that he was being resistant. "I'm not resisting," David said, his voice strained. "I'm trying to do what you're asking." But they weren't listening. Gutierrez grabbed David's left arm and twisted it. The pain shot through David's shoulder, a sharp burning sensation that made him gasp. He'd been injured in training exercises before, had dealt with physical discomfort in the field, but this was different. This pain came from people who were supposed to be on his side. "Step out of the vehicle," Crocker yelled from the passenger side, reaching across to try to unbuckle the seatbelt himself. David finally got the seatbelt unclasped and tried to step out, but Gutierrez was still pulling his arm at an odd angle. He stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe. To the officers, it must have looked like he was resisting, but he was just trying not to fall. That's when he felt the spray. Pepper spray is designed to incapacitate. It's meant to stop someone in their tracks, to cause enough pain and disorientation that they can't fight back. David had been through plenty of training exercises involving tear gas and irritants. He thought he knew what to expect. He was wrong. The spray hit him directly in the face, and it felt like his entire head was on fire. His eyes slammed shut involuntarily. Tears poured down his face. His nose and throat burned like he'd inhaled acid. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe properly. He coughed and gasped, his body's natural reaction to the chemical assault. "Stop resisting," someone shouted, though David wasn't resisting at all. He was just trying to breathe, trying to see, trying to understand why this was happening to him. Hands grabbed him again, this time with more force. They pulled him completely out of the vehicle and shoved him toward the ground. David's knees hit the concrete hard. He felt the rough texture of the parking lot beneath him as they forced him down onto his stomach. His uniform, the same one he'd worn with pride for 15 years, was now covered in dirt and grime. They wrenched his arms behind his back. The metal handcuffs clicked into place tight enough that they bit into his wrists. David's face was pressed against the cold ground and he could taste blood in his mouth. He must have bit his lip when they threw him down. "Please," he managed to say between coughs, his voice hoarse from the pepper spray. "Please, I can't breathe very well." No one responded with compassion. Instead, someone's knee pressed into his back, adding weight, making it even harder to draw breath. David's mind raced through everything he'd learned about these situations. Don't resist, stay calm. Comply with orders. But he was doing all of that and it wasn't making any difference. "Check him for weapons," Gutierrez ordered. Hands patted him down roughly, checking his pockets, his waistband, his ankles. They found his wallet, his phone, his car keys. Nothing illegal. Nothing dangerous. Just the ordinary things any person carries. "He's clean," Crocker announced. David lay there on the ground, handcuffed and humiliated, while the three officers stood over him. Through his burning, watering eyes, he could make out their shapes. They were talking to each other now, their voices lower, probably trying to figure out what to do next. "What's your name?" Gutierrez asked, his tone slightly less aggressive now that David was restrained and clearly not a threat. "Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson," he answered, his voice still rough. "United States Army." There was a pause. A brief moment where David hoped that maybe, just maybe, they'd realize they'd made a terrible mistake. That they'd see him as a fellow American who dedicated his life to serving his country, that his rank and his service would mean something. "Why didn't you stop right away?" Gutierrez asked, sidestepping the revelation about David's military service. "I was looking for a safe place," David explained, trying to keep his voice respectful despite everything. "The road was dark. I pulled into the gas station for everyone's safety. I wasn't trying to run or anything like that." "It looked like you were trying to evade us," Crocker said. "I wasn't. I promise you, I wasn't." David's face was still against the ground, making it hard to speak clearly. "Can I please sit up? The pepper spray is making it hard to breathe down here." After what felt like forever, they allowed him to sit up, though his hands remained cuffed behind his back. David blinked repeatedly, trying to clear his vision. Tears and mucus ran down his face and there was nothing he could do to wipe them away. The burning sensation wasn't getting better. If anything, it seemed to be spreading, making his entire face feel like it was swelling. "What was the reason for the stop?" David asked, returning to the question that had started all of this. "I still don't understand what I did wrong." The officers exchanged glances. Gutierrez spoke first. "Your license plate wasn't visible." "I have temporary tags in the rear window," David said, his voice gaining a bit of strength despite the burning in his throat. "They're right there. You can see them. The car is newly purchased and everything is legal." Another pause. Crocker walked back to David's SUV and shined his flashlight at the rear window. David couldn't see him, but he heard the officer's footsteps, heard him moving around the vehicle. "There are tags here," Crocker called out. The weight of that statement hung in the air. There were tags. They were visible. They were legal, which meant this entire stop, this entire violent encounter, had been based on either a mistake or something worse. David sat there on the cold ground, handcuffed and covered in pepper spray, and waited for an apology that he somehow knew wasn't coming. He waited for them to say they'd made an error, that they'd overreacted, that this had all been a terrible misunderstanding. Instead, Gutierrez said, "Well, we need to verify everything. Make sure there's no warrants or anything." They ran his license. They checked his registration. They called in his information to dispatch. And David sat there, still handcuffed, still in pain, while they went through the motions of justifying what they'd done. Other cars pulled into the gas station during this time. People getting fuel, buying snacks, going about their normal evening activities. Some of them stared at the scene. Some of them quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. David wondered what they thought when they saw him sitting there on the ground in his military uniform, surrounded by police officers clearly in distress. Did they think he was a criminal? Did they assume he must have done something terrible to warrant this treatment? Or did some of them see the truth that something very wrong was happening here? The radio crackled. "No warrants. License is valid. Registration is current, of course it was." David had told them that from the beginning. He'd done nothing wrong. He was a decorated military officer driving home from work. But none of that had mattered when the officers first saw him. None of that had stopped them from treating him like a threat. "We're going to let you go with a warning," Gutierrez said finally, as if he was doing David a favor. A warning for what? David wanted to ask. A warning for driving while black? A warning for having the audacity to pull into a well-lit area instead of stopping on a dark road? A warning for being terrified when 3 officers surrounded his vehicle with their hands on their weapons? But he didn't ask those questions. He'd learned a long time ago that there were times to speak up and times to stay quiet. Right now, his priority was getting home alive. Getting home to his wife and kids. Getting home so he could figure out what to do about what had just happened. They uncuffed him finally. The relief of having his arms free again was immediate, though his wrists ached where the metal had been. David brought his hands around to his face, trying to wipe away some of the pepper spray residue, but that only made it worse. His hands now burned too from touching his contaminated face. "You can go," Crocker said, gesturing toward David's vehicle. David stood up slowly. His knees hurt from hitting the ground. His back ached where the knee had pressed into it. His face was on fire from the spray. His wrists were sore from the handcuffs. His uniform was filthy and damaged, but he was alive, and that was something. He walked back to his SUV on shaky legs. The officers watched him go, making no move to help him, making no attempt to apologize or explain themselves further. They just stood there, waiting for him to leave so they could move on to whatever else their night shift had in store. David got into his vehicle and sat there for a moment, his hands trembling as he tried to put the key in the ignition. The pepper spray was still making his eyes water, still making it hard to see clearly. He wasn't sure he should be driving in this condition, but he knew he couldn't stay here any longer. As he pulled out of the gas station, he looked in his rearview mirror one last time. The 3 officers were getting back into their patrol cars, their body cameras having recorded everything. David didn't know it yet, but those recordings would change everything. For now, though, all he knew was that he needed to get home. He needed to see his family. He needed to wash the pepper spray off his face and try to process what had just happened to him on this cold December night in Virginia. David made it home around 10:30 that night, though the 20-minute drive felt like it took hours. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, and every time he saw headlights behind him, his heart jumped. The pepper spray residue still burned his face and his eyes watered so badly that he had to keep blinking to see the road clearly. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light was on. His wife Rebecca always left it on for him when he worked late. It was a small thing, but tonight it felt like a beacon guiding him home to safety. He sat in the car for a full minute after parking, trying to compose himself, trying to figure out how to explain what had just happened. Rebecca opened the front door before he could even get out. She must have heard him pull up, but when she saw him walking toward the house, her expression changed from welcome to alarm. "David, oh my God, what happened to your face?" He looked at himself in the hallway mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. His eyes were red and swollen, with tears still streaming down his cheeks from the pepper spray. His face was puffy and inflamed. His uniform was dirty and torn at the knee. There was a scrape on his cheek that he hadn't even noticed until now. "I got pulled over," he said quietly, his voice still hoarse. "Pulled over?" Rebecca's voice rose. "It looks like you got attacked." "David, what happened?" He told her everything. Every detail. The flashing lights, the officers surrounding his car, the shouting, the pepper spray, being thrown to the ground, the handcuffs. Rebecca listened with her hand over her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. When he finished, she wrapped her arms around him and held him tight. "We need to report this," she said firmly. "This isn't right. This isn't okay." "I know," David agreed. "I just need to think about how to handle it." He showered for a long time that night, letting the water wash away the pepper spray and the dirt and the humiliation of what had happened. But no amount of water could wash away the feeling of being treated like a criminal in his own country, while wearing the uniform he'd worn with honor for 15 years. The next morning, David called a lawyer. A friend from his Army unit had recommended someone who specialized in civil rights cases. The lawyer's name was Richard Chen, and when David told him what had happened, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Were there body cameras?" Richard asked. "Yes, all 3 officers had them." "Good. That's very good. We need to get that footage." Richard explained the process. They'd file a formal complaint with the Windsor Police Department. They'd request the body camera footage through a Freedom of Information Act request. They'd document David's injuries and build a case showing that his constitutional rights had been violated. "I have to warn you," Richard said. "These cases can be difficult. Police departments protect their own. But if what you're telling me is accurate and if the video backs it up, we have a strong case." Over the next few weeks, David tried to return to normal life. He went to work at Fort Lee. He spent time with his family. He attended his daughter's basketball games and helped his son with his homework. But the incident haunted him. He found himself constantly looking in his rearview mirror when he drove. He avoided going out after dark. He couldn't shake the feeling that something like this could happen again at any moment. The Windsor Police Department delayed releasing the body camera footage. They claimed it was part of an ongoing investigation. They said they needed time to review it. David and Richard kept pushing, kept filing requests, kept demanding transparency. Then, in early February, someone leaked the video. David never found out who did it. Maybe it was a police officer with a conscience. Maybe it was a records clerk who was horrified by what they saw. Maybe it was someone in the town administration who knew the truth needed to come out. Whoever it was, they uploaded the body camera footage to social media, and within hours it exploded. The video showed everything. It showed David pulling into the gas station with his hands clearly visible on the steering wheel. It showed the officers approaching with aggression from the very start. It showed David asking repeatedly what he'd done wrong and never getting a real answer. It showed the threats, the pepper spray, the violence, all directed at a man who was clearly trying to comply. But what made the video truly powerful were the words. David's voice, calm and respectful even in the face of such aggression, asking, "What's going on? I'm serving this country and this is how I'm treated?" Those words, captured on camera, resonated with millions of people. By the next morning, the video had been viewed over 10 million times. News outlets picked it up. CNN ran it. Fox News ran it. Local stations across the country featured it in their broadcasts. Social media was flooded with reactions, with people expressing outrage, sadness, and frustration at what they were seeing. David's phone started ringing constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Veterans organizations wanted to show their support. Civil rights groups wanted to use his case as an example of systemic problems in policing. The attention was overwhelming. The hashtag Justice for David Thompson started trending on Twitter. People shared their own stories of similar encounters with police. Veterans posted photos of themselves in uniform, with captions like, "I served my country," too, and "This could have been me." The conversation grew beyond just David's case to encompass larger issues of racial profiling, police brutality, and the treatment of people of color in America. The Windsor Police Department issued a statement. It was short and carefully worded. "We are aware of the incident involving one of our officers and a member of the military. We take these matters seriously and are conducting a full investigation." But the public wasn't satisfied with that response. The video was clear. There was nothing to investigate. Everyone could see what had happened. Calls for accountability grew louder. The Virginia governor's office released a statement saying they were deeply concerned by the video and were monitoring the situation. The Attorney General announced that the state police would conduct an independent review of the incident. Pressure mounted from every direction. Within a week of the video going viral, Officer Gutierrez was fired. Or rather, he was allowed to resign, which meant he could potentially get a job at another police department. Officer Crocker was placed on administrative leave. The third officer faced an internal investigation, but many people felt that wasn't enough. They wanted criminal charges. They wanted systemic reform. They wanted to ensure this would never happen to anyone else. David decided to do something he hadn't planned on. He agreed to do an interview with a major news network. He sat in a television studio with bright lights and cameras pointed at him, and he told his story to millions of viewers. "I served my country for 15 years, he said, his voice steady but emotional. "I've been deployed overseas multiple times. I've risked my life for the values this country stands for. And on that night, I was treated like I was the enemy, not because of anything I did, but because of how I look." The interviewer asked him what he wanted people to take away from his story. "I want people to understand that this isn't just about me," David explained. "This happens to people every day. People who don't have video evidence. People who don't have lawyers. People whose stories never make the news. I'm one of the lucky ones because the truth came out. But how many others are out there whose truth never gets told? He talked about the fear he felt that night. Not just for himself, but thinking about his kids. "I have a 17-year-old son who's about to start driving," David said. "And now I have to have conversations with him that no parent should have to have. I have to teach him how to stay alive during a traffic stop, not how to be polite or respectful, but how to survive. That's not the country I thought I was serving." The interview went viral too. Clips from it were shared millions of times. David became a face of the movement for police reform, though he'd never asked for that role. He was just a soldier who wanted to go home after work without being assaulted. Veterans groups rallied around him. The American Legion issued a statement condemning what had happened. Veterans of foreign wars called for justice. Active duty service members, though limited in what they could say publicly, found ways to show their support. But not everyone was on David's side. Some people defended the officers, saying David should have complied faster, or that he shouldn't have pulled into the gas station. Online comments argued that the officers felt threatened or that David must have done something to provoke them. The divided reactions showed just how complicated these issues were in America. David's family struggled with the sudden attention. His kids saw their father's face on television and social media. They heard people at school talking about the incident. Some classmates were supportive, but others made insensitive comments. Rebecca worried constantly about her husband's safety, especially after he started receiving threatening messages from people who felt he was making police officers look bad. Through it all, David maintained his dignity. He didn't lash out at his critics. He didn't call for violence or revenge. He simply continued to tell his story and advocate for change. He participated in town halls about police reform. He spoke at military bases about service members' rights. He became an educator, using his painful experience to help others. The video continued to circulate for weeks. Every time it seemed like the story might fade from public attention, something would bring it back. A new detail would emerge, or another similar incident would happen somewhere else in the country, and people would share David's video again as an example of why reform was needed. Richard, his lawyer, told him that the video was the strongest piece of evidence they could have hoped for. "Without this footage, it would have been your word against 3 police officers," Richard explained. "The video changes everything. It shows undeniable proof of what happened." David thought about that often. How many people had similar experiences but no video to prove it? How many had been dismissed, disbelieved, or ignored because they didn't have evidence? The video had saved him in a way, had validated his truth, but it also highlighted how broken the system was that video evidence was even necessary for people to believe him. As winter turned to spring, the legal process moved forward. The attention from the viral video had made it impossible for the case to be swept under the rug. Too many people were watching now. Too many people demanded justice. The pressure was on, and everyone knew that how this case was resolved would send a message far beyond Windsor, Virginia. The conference room at Richard Chen's law office was filled with documents. Video stills and legal briefs spread across a long mahogany table. David sat across from Richard and 2 other attorneys from the firm who'd joined the case, once it became clear how significant it was. Outside the windows, spring had arrived in Virginia, but inside this room, they were still dissecting every second of that December night. "The depositions are scheduled to start next week," Richard explained, sliding a stack of papers toward David. "This is what we can expect them to say based on their official reports. But here's the thing. Their reports don't match what we see in the video." David picked up the report filed by Officer Gutierrez. Reading it made his blood boil. According to Gutierrez's account, David had been aggressive and non-compliant from the start. The report claimed David had refused to exit the vehicle despite numerous lawful commands. It stated that pepper spray was deployed only after David made a sudden movement toward his waistband, suggesting he might be armed. "This is a lie," David said, his voice tight with anger. "I never reached for my waistband. I had my hands on the steering wheel the entire time until they grabbed me." "We know," Richard said calmly. "And that's exactly why we have a case. The video proves these reports are false. When we get them under oath in depositions, they'll have to either admit they lied in their reports or continue lying under oath, which is perjury." The legal strategy was becoming clear. This wasn't just about David anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of behavior, about showing how officers could write reports that justified their actions, knowing that most of the time, there'd be no video evidence to contradict them. The town of Windsor had hired a law firm from Richmond to defend the case. They were experienced in defending police misconduct lawsuits, and they'd already started their own strategy. They filed motions to dismiss the case, arguing that the officers had acted reasonably under the circumstances. They claimed qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that protects government officials from lawsuits unless they violated clearly established constitutional rights. Qualified immunity is going to be their main defense, Richard explained during one of their many meetings. They'll argue that a reasonable officer could have believed their actions were lawful, but the video is so clear, so egregious, that I think we can overcome that defense. The first deposition was with Officer Crocker. David wasn't allowed in the room for it, but Richard came out during a break to give him an update. "He's nervous," Richard said. "He keeps contradicting himself. First he says you were aggressive, then he admits you had your hands visible. First he says the stop was justified. Then he can't explain why temporary tags in the window weren't sufficient." The deposition transcripts made for interesting reading. Under questioning, Crocker admitted he hadn't actually seen whether David had license plates or not when they initiated the stop. He admitted the temporary tags were visible once they approached the vehicle. He admitted David wasn't armed, wasn't wanted for any crime, and hadn't committed any traffic violation. "So why did you treat him as a high-risk stop?" Richard had asked. "It seemed suspicious that he didn't stop right away," Crocker answered. "But he stopped within a quarter mile at a well-lit location, correct?" "Yes. And there's no law requiring someone to stop on a dark road versus a lit area, is there?" "No, I suppose not." Officer Gutierrez's deposition was even more revealing. He was defensive from the start, insisting he'd done everything by the book. But as Richard walked him through the video second by second, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. At this point in the video, you can see Lieutenant Colonel Thompson has his hands on the steering wheel, correct? Richard asked. "Yes." "And he's asking what he did wrong, correct?" "Yes." "And rather than answer his question, you threaten him, correct? You say you're gonna get it, don't you?" "I was trying to get him to comply. By threatening him, by giving him lawful commands. Was you're gonna get it a lawful command?" Gutierrez paused. "I was establishing control of the situation." The deposition went on for hours. Richard asked about Gutierrez's training, about department policies on use of force, about de-escalation techniques. Gutierrez admitted he'd been trained in all of those things. He admitted the situation could have been handled differently. But he insisted he'd felt threatened, though he couldn't articulate exactly what David had done to threaten him. The third officer's deposition was shorter. He'd arrived late to the scene and hadn't been as directly involved. But his testimony was still damaging to the defense because he admitted he hadn't seen David do anything that warranted the level of force used. Alongside the depositions, Richard had hired expert witnesses. One was a former police chief from California who reviewed the video and the department's policies. His report was scathing. "This traffic stop violated virtually every best practice in modern policing," he wrote. "The officers escalated rather than de-escalated. They used force before it was necessary. They failed to communicate clearly with the subject. Most critically, they treated the situation as high risk without any factual basis for doing so." Another expert, a psychologist who specialized in implicit bias, provided testimony about how racial stereotypes could influence officer behavior. "When officers perceive a threat where none exists," she explained in her report, "it's often because they're responding to unconscious biases rather than actual behavior." The fact that Lieutenant Colonel Thompson was in military uniform, clearly unarmed and compliant, should have signaled that he was not a threat. The officer's inability to recognize this suggests bias played a role. The town of Windsor tried to fight back. Their experts argued that officers have to make split-second decisions under pressure. They claimed that David's decision to drive to the gas station created reasonable suspicion that he was trying to evade police. They suggested that in today's dangerous environment, officers had to be cautious. But their arguments kept running into the same problem: the video. No matter how they tried to spin it, the video showed officers treating a compliant, unarmed man in military uniform with extreme aggression for no clear reason. As the case developed, more information came to light about the officers involved. Someone leaked Officer Gutierrez's personnel file, which showed he'd had multiple complaints filed against him over the years. Nothing had ever resulted in serious discipline, but there was a pattern. Several complaints involved excessive force. Several involved interactions with people of color. The department had noted in his file that he needed additional training in de-escalation, but that training had apparently never happened. The local newspaper started investigating the Windsor Police Department more broadly. They filed Freedom of Information requests for data on traffic stops, use of force incidents, and complaints against officers. What they found was troubling. People of color made up about 30% of Windsor's population, but they accounted for nearly 70% of traffic stops. The disparity was stark and hard to explain away. Community meetings were held in Windsor's town hall. Residents, many of whom had their own stories about negative interactions with police, spoke passionately about the need for change. The town council faced intense pressure to do something, not just about David's case, but about policing practices in general. Meanwhile, David's lawsuit moved through the court system. The town of Windsor made a settlement offer early on, $50,000 and no admission of wrongdoing. Richard advised David to reject it, and he did immediately. "This isn't about money," David told the press when asked about the settlement offer. "This is about accountability. These officers need to face consequences for what they did." The town came back with a higher offer, then an even higher one. Each time David refused. He wanted his day in court. He wanted the full story told. He wanted a verdict that would send a clear message that this behavior was unacceptable. The legal battle took a toll on David. He spent countless hours in meetings with lawyers, reviewing documents, preparing for his own deposition. When his turn came to be deposed by the town's lawyers, they tried to paint him as the aggressor. They asked why he didn't stop immediately. They questioned whether he'd been disrespectful to the officers. They tried to find any small thing that might justify what had happened to him. David remained calm and truthful throughout. Yes, he'd been scared. Yes, he'd asked questions instead of immediately exiting the vehicle. But he'd also been polite. He'd kept his hands visible, and he'd done nothing that warranted being pepper sprayed and thrown to the ground. His commanding officer at Fort Lee had to be deposed as well. The colonel spoke highly of David's character, his service record, his leadership abilities. "Lieutenant Colonel Thompson is exactly the kind of officer we want in the Army," he testified. "He's disciplined, respectful, and follows the rules. The idea that he would be aggressive or non-compliant with police officers is inconsistent with everything I know about him." By summer, both sides had finished their depositions and submitted their evidence. The judge scheduled a conference to discuss whether the case would go to trial, or if there was any possibility of settlement. Richard felt confident about their position, but he warned David that trials were unpredictable. "Juries are hard to read," Richard explained. "And even with video evidence, some people will find ways to justify what the officers did. We have a strong case, but there's always risk." David understood the risk, but he also understood what was at stake. This case had become bigger than him. It represented something important about justice, about accountability, about whether the system could actually work when someone had been wronged. The summer sun beat down on Virginia, as lawyers on both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be a significant case. The whole country seemed to be watching Windsor, Virginia, waiting to see what would happen next.
Would the
Be justice for a decorated military officer who'd been treated like a criminal, or would the system protect those who'd wronged him? The answers would come soon enough, but the wait felt endless for David and his family, who just wanted this nightmare to be over, so they could try to move forward with their lives. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late August. David was at his office at Fort Lee, reviewing training schedules for the upcoming quarter, when his phone buzzed. It was Richard Chen, and the tone in his voice told David this was the call they'd been waiting for. "They want to settle," Richard said, "and this time it's serious." David closed his office door and sat down. "How serious?" $400,000. Plus they're agreeing to implement comprehensive police reforms. Plus they're issuing a public apology acknowledging that your rights were violated. This is everything we asked for, David. $400,000. It was more money than David had ever imagined. But more important than the money were the other terms. The town of Windsor would have to overhaul its police department. Officers would undergo training in de-escalation, implicit bias, and constitutional policing. A civilian oversight board would be created to review complaints against officers. Body camera footage would be made available more quickly in cases of alleged misconduct. The policies that had allowed David's encounter to happen would be dismantled and rebuilt. "What do you think I should do?" David asked. "I think we could win more at trial," Richard said honestly. "But trials are risky and they're emotionally draining. This settlement accomplishes your goals. It holds them accountable, it changes the system, and it compensates you for what you went through. I'd recommend taking it, but the decision is yours." David talked it over with Rebecca that evening. They sat in their backyard while the kids were inside doing homework, and they discussed what this all meant. The money would help. David had been in therapy since the incident, dealing with the trauma of what had happened. That wasn't cheap. The legal battle had taken time away from his work and his family. There had been costs, both financial and emotional. But more than that, Rebecca pointed out that the reforms were what David had been fighting for all along. "You wanted to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," she reminded him. "These changes could actually do that. Isn't that worth something?" David thought about all the other people who might drive through Windsor, Virginia, in the years to come. Black people, brown people, people who looked like him. If these reforms were implemented properly, maybe they wouldn't have to experience what he'd experienced. Maybe they could drive home from work without fear. "Okay," David told Richard the next day. "I'll take the settlement. But I want to be there when they announce the reforms. I want to make sure they follow through." The settlement was finalized in September. The town of Windsor held a press conference to announce it, and David stood at the podium alongside the mayor and the town council members. It was surreal, standing next to the same officials who'd defended the police department just months earlier, now admitting they'd been wrong. The mayor read a prepared statement. "The town of Windsor acknowledges that Lieutenant Colonel David Thompson's constitutional rights were violated during his traffic stop in December. We apologize to Lieutenant Colonel Thompson and his family for the trauma they experienced. We are committed to ensuring this never happens again, which is why we're implementing comprehensive reforms to our police department." David spoke too, keeping his remarks brief but powerful. "I didn't want to be here," he said, looking out at the crowd of reporters and community members. "I didn't want any of this to happen. But since it did, I'm glad something good can come from it. These reforms aren't just words on paper. They represent real change that can protect real people. I'll be watching to make sure they're implemented, and I encourage everyone in this community to hold your leaders accountable." The reforms rolled out over the following months. The Windsor Police Department brought in consultants to redesign their training programs. Officers underwent 40 hours of additional training in de-escalation techniques. They learned about implicit bias and how unconscious prejudices could affect their decisions. They studied constitutional law and the rights of citizens during police encounters. The Civilian Oversight Board was established with 7 members from the community. They had the power to review body camera footage, investigate complaints, and recommend discipline for officers who violated policies. It wasn't perfect, but it was more accountability than had existed before. Officer Gutierrez never worked in law enforcement again. After being forced to resign from Windsor, he applied to several other departments, but David's case had made national news. No one wanted to hire an officer with that kind of baggage.
He ended up taking a job in private security.
A significant step down from his previous position. Officer Crocker remained with the Windsor Police Department, but was required to undergo remedial training and was placed on probationary status. He was partnered with a senior officer who was tasked with mentoring him and ensuring he followed proper procedures. Some in the community wanted him fired too, but the police union had protected him to some degree. The third officer transferred to another department in a different county. He left quietly without much fanfare, and David often wondered if that officer had learned anything from the incident, or if he was still out there somewhere, treating people the same way he'd treated David. As for David, the settlement money helped, but it couldn't erase what had happened. He continued in therapy, working through the trauma of that night. He found himself still getting anxious when he saw police cars while driving. He still checked his rearview mirror constantly. The fear had been planted deep and it would take time to uproot it, but he also found purpose in advocacy work. He was invited to speak at police academies, where he shared his story with recruits who were just beginning their careers in law enforcement. "You'll have a badge and a gun," he told them. You'll have power over people in vulnerable situations. How you use that power defines who you are. You can use it to protect and serve, or you can use it to intimidate and harm. The choice is yours. He spoke at military bases too, educating service members about their rights. You serve your country with honor, he told his fellow soldiers. But that uniform doesn't protect you from bad policing. Know your rights. Record interactions when you can. Don't be afraid to file complaints when you're treated unjustly. David also worked with civil rights organizations, helping them develop training materials and policy recommendations for police reform. His case became a model for what could be achieved when victims of police misconduct had video evidence and were willing to fight for accountability. The national conversation about policing continued to evolve. David's case was one of many that year that highlighted problems with how police interacted with people of color. But his case stood out because he was a military officer, because the video was so clear, and because he'd achieved some measure of justice that many others never got. A year after the incident, David returned to Windsor for the first time since the settlement. The town had invited him to speak at a community event, celebrating the progress they'd made on police reform. He was hesitant at first, not sure he wanted to go back to the place where he'd been traumatized. But Rebecca encouraged him, and he decided it was important to see if the reforms were actually working. The event was held in the town's community center, and the turnout was larger than expected. Officers from the reformed police department attended, along with community members, town officials, and activists who'd pushed for change. The new police chief, brought in from outside Windsor specifically to lead the reforms, spoke about the progress they'd made and the work still ahead. When it was David's turn to speak, he looked out at the diverse crowd and felt something he hadn't felt in that town before. Hope. "A year ago I was pepper sprayed and thrown to the ground on a street in this town," he said. "I was treated like a criminal when I'd done nothing wrong. That shouldn't happen to anyone, regardless of the color of their skin or what they do for a living," he continued. "But what happened after that matters too. This community could have circled the wagons and defended the status quo. Instead, you demanded better. You implemented real reforms. You're holding your police department accountable. That's not easy and it's not finished, but it's important. Keep pushing. Keep demanding excellence from those who are supposed to serve you." The crowd applauded, and afterward, several people came up to shake David's hand and share their own stories. Some were positive, talking about improved interactions with police officers who seemed more respectful and professional. Others were still struggling, still facing discrimination, still fighting for the kind of treatment every person deserves. David met some of the police officers who'd gone through the new training. They seemed genuinely committed to doing better, to treating people with dignity and respect. One young officer, fresh out of the academy, told David that his case had been discussed extensively in their training. "They showed us the video," the officer said, "and they told us this is what not to do. This is what